Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Lily Allen, titled Sheezus. I've got a somewhat complicated relationship with Lily Allen. You see, for the longest time, she was one of the most frustrating acts I've ever listened to. An act with very clear talent in instrumentation and songwriting. And, I could tell she was genuinely clever and had a knack for incisive, biting lyrics, but every time I'd go back to that first album, All Right Still, I despised it more and more every single listen. The rational part of my brain was telling me that this wasn't a bad record, but for the life of me, I hated the framing of that album. Overloaded with vapid, spiteful bitchiness that screamed of self-aware hypocrisy, but didn't have the nuance or depth to really justify it. Now, I'm told some of this is a British thing and how Lily Allen is supposed to be funny, but for me, it was always aggressively the opposite. She was unfunny. And my issue was always in the framing, which was trying to paint Lily Allen as at least a flawed protagonist figure who was skewering shallow mainstream culture. And while there was some self-awareness in how awful she came across, it was never enough to support her hollow justifications, and I never felt that her rather smug and inert delivery was cute or charming or interesting enough to really ignore the problems here. Thankfully, she seemed to clue into some of this problem in time for her second album, It's Not Me, It's You, which honestly I liked a fair bit more, and making Lily Allen a little bit more sympathetic and the framing a little bit more intelligent. But at the same time, the songwriting went broader in its portrayal of her newfound maturity, and her stabs at deeper topics like religion and politics were shallow at best, almost cartoonish to the point of not being able to take them remotely seriously. On top of that, her instrumentation was even more of a mixed bag, displaying more variety and more influences and more styles, but some seriously obnoxious hooks I just couldn't stand. And the more I listened to that album, the more I got the impression that Lily Allen wasn't really trying all that hard, or really had her heart in her music, which she then flat out admitted after the release of that album, and then proceeded to take a 5-year hiatus. But you know what? Now she's back with an album titled Sheezus, a title modeled off of Kanye West's controversial and critically acclaimed album that came out last year. And honestly, I'll admit it, I was intrigued where she was going with this, because there is a recognizable similarity between both of these artists. For one, they both have a tendency to mix genres in unconventional ways that's kind of attractive. They can both be insightful and somewhat self-aware songwriters about how terrible they can occasionally come across in their music, and yet they both have egos the size of the British Isles and can occasionally be astonishingly full of shit. So, you know what? I figured even if the album sucked, it would at least be interesting to talk about. So I stepped up here and I gave it a couple of listens. How did it turn out? Well, I'll be blunt. This album is startlingly like Sheezus. Not in just that they share a lot of similar themes and elements and are both somewhat self-aware, but it also suffers from many, if not all, of the same problems that album does. On the one hand, it sure as hell makes Sheezus by Lily Allen an interesting record to talk about, but at the same time, it's a frustrating, messy, and more than a little exasperating album to sit through. And like with Sheezus, I won't say that Sheezus completely works, because I don't think it does, not by a long shot, but at the same time, I get what it's trying to do, and I can kind of respect that. And while I'm a little amazed that Lily Allen was so uncannily able to replicate her experience of Sheezus with her newest album and give it her own unique spin, there's a certain lack of self-awareness to that recreation that really does hurt this record. So, okay, first, for context, let's talk a bit about Kanye West's Sheezus, because some of you might not have seen the review I did on my blog of it, and I never really covered it in a video. So let me stress that I do mostly like that album, even so much to say that I'm going to put Blood on the Leaves as one of my favorite songs of 2013, because it is. But I know that album has huge flaws. It's unnecessarily hyperbolic, Kanye's rhymes are not close to great, it's rushed, it's messy, and it's also very derivative instrumentally of other noise rap acts. But on another note, I get what Kanye was trying to do. Since the beginning of his career, Kanye's rapping has always been characterized, in my mind, by one element that should have crippled his career years ago: uncompromising, unflinching honesty. It's really the only reason why the vulnerability of 808s and Heartbreaks really works for me. It's the reason why the braggadocious elements of My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy ring so resoundingly intentionally hollow, and it's the reason why he was able to channel his own instability and fury and knowing hypocrisy into Yeezus. My interpretation of that album is that Kanye knows what he's saying is hyperbolic, hypocritical bullshit on a deeper level. And since he's intensely aware and cares way too much what the world thinks of him, he makes the choice to epitomize every single ludicrous stereotype of black male rappers of which he can possibly think. Because in his mind, he's giving the world what they want. That's the reason why he uses such a bellicose delivery and outlandish production. He's going to the absolute extreme, at least in his mind. But where Kanye fails here is that this sort of commentary and attempted satire of said material by going broader and above and beyond is shoddy, poorly articulated, and mired in incoherence and inconsistency, and not to mention redundancy. I mean, it's not like rappers haven't made the exact same commentary that Kanye has made, or have used this sort of outlandish production to do it. So okay, what does this all have to do with Sheezus? Well, actually, surprisingly quite a bit. Not only are there a surprising number of callbacks to Kanye's album, it also features the most rough, hard-edged, and electronic production that Lily Allen has ever used. Now, I won't say it's great or all that memorable. Most of it falls into conventional electronic pop with trap-inspired hip-hop edge and the darker synths and the hi-hats, but there are a few moments that reflect the variety that was always evident in her older sound, like the chipper melody of Air Balloon, the funkier guitar on Insincerely Yours and Life for Me, the muted, shimmering piano and Take My Place, the accordion-driven side of As Long As I Got You, and the snarled dubstep-inspired edge of You Are All Bad Man. And while I do appreciate and like the more melodic focus and reasonably restrained production, I have no idea why anyone thought auto-tune on Lily Allen's voice was remotely necessary. She already brings a very muted, subtle personality to her albums and her delivery, so why on earth would you strip away some of that subtlety by throwing a layer of auto-tune on top of it, other than just to mimic Kanye's usage of the tool? As much as I appreciate the homage, it doesn't really work here. And it doesn't work for Lily Allen, that's for damn sure. Unfortunately, unlike Kanye's shift to a harsher sound on Yeezus, the instrumentation and production on Sheezus is by far its least interesting element, which really is honestly a shame because at least Lily Allen used to have a greater breadth of flavor in this particular side of her music. So let's move on to lyrics and theme. Now, I stand by the fact that Lily Allen is at least a clever songwriter, and she's got a gift for meter and wordplay that I won't deny. Although I will say that this album hasn't exactly recovered the wit lost in going broader that she did 5 years ago. And as with Kanye on Yeezus, Lily Allen is playing up the most irreverent and exaggerated parts of her persona. Her bragging on Sheezus and Hard Out Here, the anti-party party songs and Our Time and Life for Me, and her smug detachment and dismissiveness on Latecomer and Insincerely Yours, and to a lesser extent on As Long As I Got You. And I'll admit that her satire is just as blunt and direct as Kanye's was, perhaps even stronger, especially on the broad anti-internet troll track You Are All Bad Man. But here's where we run into the first problem. There are moments on this album where Lily Allen is opting for more sincere material, and we're expected to buy into her emotional drama. And you know what? While her delivery mostly pulls it off and sells it, it's undercut by the veneer of self-aware irony that's slathered all over most of the rest of this album. Lily Allen, you can't have it both ways here. Plus, at least when Kanye West created an exaggerated caricature of himself on Yeezus, he had a deeper reason. He went all out to do it, and he was always punctured somewhat by his own honesty. Lily Allen, however, sounds a lot less committed to that sort of exaggerated persona that she would need to pull off start at some of these songs, even though the ego is all definitely still here, and it means that her execution comes across as a lot more calculating and a lot more unconvincing. Even on her more honest songs, I just don't buy into them as much. It really doesn't help her case when she includes songs like Silver Spoon, which falls into the Vampire Weekend school of unwelcome privileged defensiveness, where Lily Allen lashes out at people who have criticized her for her opulent upbringing. Now, at this point in career, does anyone else besides Lily Allen care about these sort of comments? I mean, shouldn't her career stand by itself at this point, 3 albums in? Now, the fact that Lily Allen really placed the song on this album shows that, just like Kanye, She's far more concerned with the presumed haters than they are with her possible delusions of grandeur. And only feeding into it with a song like this just makes it so much worse and a lot less tolerable. And then there's the biggest problem, and the most ironic mirroring of Sheezus yet. The satirical points that Lily Allen is trying to make through her lyrics and sounds, they've been done before. And they've been done a whole lot better. Now, look, that's not saying that songs like You Are All Bad Man aren't good songs or songs that I actually mostly like for their message. But look, You Are All Bad Man is nowhere near St. Vincent's Digital Witness, which covers a lot of the same ground a lot more effectively, and it did it this year. All the heavily auto-tuned third-wave feminist titillation in songs like Hard Out Here might be revolutionary, except we already live in a world where Kesha already covered this subject in comprehensive detail on her album 4 years ago, with songs like Grow Up Hair and Hungover, amongst others. And Natalia Kills hit on a lot of the same subjects on her album last year. Hell, songs like Our Time, talking about the whole emptiness of partying, might work a little bit better in a world where Miley Cyrus's We Can't Stop had played with a very strikingly similar song, tempo, and tone, and played it all completely unironically. And that's when the framing is right and proper and good. For me, the worst song on this album by a mile is Life for Me, a song where Lily Allen seems to somewhat miss some of the partying, even though she's acknowledged that it is emptiness personified, and that she's already been there, she's done that. But even though by her own admission, her current life is complete and perfect, and the upbeat, satisfied tone of the song and other songs on this album completely agrees with it, which makes her commentary and somewhat attempt to garner our sympathy for, oh, she doesn't go out hard partying anymore, come across as more condescending, and I immediately lose all sympathy for her pre-midlife crisis instantaneously. She's not part of the pop system making commentary on it. She's outside the pop landscape. She's been outside it for years now, and is attempting to muscle her way back in with cheap provocation. And even with songs like Insincerely Yours, they're covering ground that Lily Allen herself has covered on previous records and bashing vapid celebrity culture, image obsession, and even bad DJs. And since the framing places her as outside of the current pop landscape, as much as I might agree with some of her points, and I do, her execution lacks tact and deeper nuance, and thus I just can't end up sympathizing with her. So look, I don't think Sheezus is a bad album, in the same way I don't think Sheezus is a bad album, but it suffers from the exact same problems that album did. And while Sheezus by Lily Allen might have better articulated points and a little bit more nuance, it suffers from a lack of instrumental diversity, solid production, and Lily Allen sounding like she could possibly give a shit. Now for me, I'm going to be generous here and give this album a 6 out of 10, because like I said, she's a good technical songwriter, and there's a few decent vibes on this album, even if they do feel a little recycled from other mainstream pop. But it's an album really at this point that's for the fans, or as a case study in mimicry without complete self-awareness. And while it might be interesting to analyze and talk about, it's also a record, just like Kanye West Sheezus, that adds up to a lot less than the sum of its parts. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can't imagine why this review would be remotely controversial, but if you have any other comments to say, leave them in the comments below. I'd be happy to hear your interpretations of this, because honestly, there's so much self-aware irony on this record, I'm almost certain I might have stepped out of bounds here. I might have gotten some parts wrong, so I'd be happy to hear your opinion. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or if there's any other albums coming out that you'd like me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. So until then, I'm Mark, this is Spectrum Pulse, I'll see you next time.